You're listening to the Utah Checkdown podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you again. It's game week. We're happy to be back. We got UCLA on the docket this week. Utah kicked off its game week with a little press conference from Kyle Whittingham. We'll hear from the players a little bit later today. But everything, for all intents and purposes, is football is back. And I think we're all happy to be back here. So just on today's episode, we're going to do a little preview of not preview. We'll call it a recap of week 0. We won't go too heavy on that, and then we'll talk Kyle Whittingham and his press conference and kind of what Utah's looking at coming into this UCLA game. So we're going to jump into that, have some fun. Football's back. We're excited. Next week we'll be able to actually talk real games and be able to see how this Utah team is. I think that's the thing that has been the most, we'll call it exciting, is just trying to see what this team is, right? Are they the team that we think they are on paper, or are they a team that may not live up to the expectations and be another middling team in the Big 12? I have a tendency to believe that they're not, but you never know until you actually see it on the field and see what happens. So before we jump into that, let me tell you about our partners, Canyon View Credit Union. At Canyon View Credit Union, it's on the house. Close a mortgage and get a free appraisal up to $600. To learn more details or apply, visit canyonviewcu.com. Also, this is the week of college football, so go ahead and sign up for college football pick'em at ksl.com. Enter for a chance to win a $100 gift card each week. We'll have also weekly prizes that the top 3 winners of each week will be able to win. So the person that picks the best out of the 5 games that we choose that week will get $100. The second, $50, and $25. And then we'll have a season-long contest as well. So if you haven't done that, go do that now. Go get your picks in, and we'll have some fun. So let's jump into a little recap of week 0. So I always say that week 0 is kind of a little bit of an appetizer to what is more football, right? And it was a good appetizer, right? Like there's a lot of good games that were being played, especially in the Big 12 side, where we got an opportunity to see what 3 teams looked like. And, the circumstances weren't equal for all of these teams in the sense that, one of these games was being played in Ireland, and you can have your frustrations about that game. You may like it, you may hate it, but, you're on a different field, and it's not one that had ideal conditions, we'll say that. So we got, a look at those, and then there's a few other games. Many of them won't necessarily have an impact on the Big 12, but still interesting nonetheless. So let's jump right into this. Let's go to Kansas State versus Iowa State. Iowa State comes away with a 24-21 win over Kansas State. Iowa State's just had Kansas State's number for the last little bit. Farmageddon has not gone in Kansas State's favor the last few years, and so it's been a struggle for the Wildcats to really get anything going. There was a lot of optimism about what this season could be. If you read a lot of the Twitter or message boards, you see the message board genius. He posts things different from different message boards, and there's a lot of Kansas State fans frustrated, right? They're frustrated saying, "Oh, look, we're the exact same team we were last year." I get that, right? Like, it's a frustrating situation to go into a game and expect to have this dynamic season. Avery Johnson's coming back for his second year as a starter. You saw progress last year, obviously a great talent, and you had to assume that he was going to make a step up in level of competition in his game. And, there just wasn't a lot of that. So it's frustrating on the Kansas State side. You obviously had, I don't know if you saw this, but Avery Johnson's dad fighting with his brother, like a legit street fight type thing after the game. So, the Johnson household is not going well right now. Kansas State is not in a good state right now. So, rough situation. But this game, it's played in Ireland. I love the novelty of it. I think it would be a great opportunity for teams to be able to do it, especially if you don't have to worry about it taking away one of your home games. But at the same time, it's losing the full college football atmosphere by going to a place that, that's just not it, right? Soccer is what they're doing, or golf, or whatever it may be in Ireland. And so it's losing some of that appeal. Honestly, like I tweeted this during the game, the field conditions didn't look great. You could barely even see the lines. It's just not a great environment to be able to start a college football season off with. And so for those purposes, I just think it's not that great to have these international games. Now you can convince me, and if Utah was in this situation, I'd love a trip to Ireland. So don't get me wrong, but I just think there's something about the college game that should be embraced in the college, arena, right? And with that said, more so in the sense of what that means to the fans. You can go to these bowl games, right? Like you can go to like Allegiant Stadium, for example, and have those, and those are fun. And I think those are at least have a little bit more regionality to it in terms of still being in the United States. But having a game played, across the world essentially in not great conditions is tough. So, I'm not going to say it's not a good environment, but at the same time, it's one of those situations that doesn't always work as well. So this is a game that, it started out chaotic. There was a lot of turnovers, a lot of defense essentially in this game early, especially in that first half. It was just a game that, it looked like a week 0, week 1 type game. All these type of games, I think every fan is excited to come in and say, oh, my team's going to be so good and we've made all these changes. But week 1 is just kind of figuring yourself out, right? You don't really understand who you have yet, especially in this era of the transfer portal. And so it takes time. And it looked like that. It looked like that for sure in this game. But in the end, like it really felt like Iowa State just had the upper hand the whole time, right? Like they had their own problems, and it wasn't perfect on their end by any means. Kansas State's defensive line looked really great on that first series, really made it tough on Rocco Becht. Iowa State found ways to be able to get yardage and kind of do their thing, but it just was one of those games that was a defensive slogfest, not a lot of great consistency. There was not a lot well, to be honest, it took like something like 8 minutes until the first pass completion. So, it was a tough environment, not one that's conducive to really trying to kind of put your best foot forward initially. So it happens. That's what the game is. Iowa State essentially, they finally at the very end come away. They have a chance where they do score a touchdown, at least on first look. And, it would have been considered more of a blowout type game. You'd have a 31-21 score. It's obviously not a blowout by any means, but at least it looks like a more convincing win. And instead, after review, it showed that the ball carrier was literally a fraction of an inch away from a touchdown. And my favorite part of this, though, is how much of a bad beat this is. If any of you watch Scott Van Pelt, you understand what a bad beat is. This was one where the betting line was 3.5, depending on what you got it at. Over under was 51.5, and that touchdown could have swayed a ton of wins or losses in whichever favor. And so, you had some people that were holding on to that line, praying that they didn't score a touchdown at the end, whereas others, if they score a touchdown, you obviously go over the spread. And that 51.5 is beat by a half a point. You get 52 points. So it was a really close situation. That's my pitch to why you sometimes don't bet on games, simply because you never know what's going to happen. And all it takes is, being that close and then deciding to knee it out at the 1 yard line. So, Iowa State obviously takes the commanding lead in the Big 12 race. It's easy to kind of look at these games and say, oh, this team is better than the other in week 1, week 0, whatever we're going to call this one. But, I think just having that win kind of sets the stage. Iowa State obviously was in the Big 12 championship game last year. So this is not a team that, is unusual to success, but this is their first season in which they had a 10-win season. So it's not like they've been dynamic and dominant every single year. This is still relatively newfound in terms of getting up into those double digits. And so really interesting to kind of see this team evolve. Are they going to continue to have the progress and success that they've had? This is a team that I think many in the media kind of viewed as not really, expected to be as good as last year. Now, with that said, they still had, championship implications and all that kind of stuff riding on their season. And so I think there's still a lot of belief that this is a good Iowa State team coming into the season. But, I think this game more than anything proved that this can be a team that does well, right? And things can go on another, in a similar trajectory as last year. So, we'll see how this goes. Week 0 is not a telling week in terms of kind of what happens. Obviously, we've seen teams win that Ireland game and go on to have bad seasons, or that it jump starts, or teams that lose that game, aka Florida State, they go on to have terrible seasons. So it's tough to really know what this will be, but obviously a good sign for Iowa State that they were able to jump in and get there. But really kind of fascinating about this game is you look at it and, the quarterbacks, two of the guys that I think are getting a lot of praise inside the Big 12 as some of the best quarterbacks in the country, in Avery Johnson and Rocco Becht. And looking at the stat line, they're not indicative of kind of how this game went, right? I think anybody that looked at the stat line would look at Avery Johnson and think that he was the better quarterback. He threw for 273 yards, 2 touchdowns on a 70% completion percentage. Meanwhile, Rocco Becht was 183 yards and 2 touchdowns on 50% completion percentage. But it was just a completely different game. These quarterbacks were at a different level. Avery Johnson looked like a shell of himself from last year. He obviously had some big plays. There was one that a pass that he threw to Jace Brown that I think was the highlight for 78 yards. It was a total of 78 yards for Jace Brown that day. It was a long reception, but it's one of those things that stats don't always tell the full truth. Rocco Becht obviously had not obviously, but he had some receivers that dropped some passes. Stats don't always tell the full truth. And so I think you do have to watch those games and kind of understand what happened. The momentum, although not always on Iowa State's side, definitely felt offensively that it was on their side. There was moments when Kansas State would kind of get into a groove and do well, but not great. So both of these teams really just didn't have outstanding performances in the weather that they were in. Kansas State rushed for 110 yards, Iowa State just 130 yards. Kansas State passed for 273 yards, and Iowa State passed for 183 yards. So it was just kind of a mid-game in terms of production, but Iowa State did exactly what they needed to be able to get the win. So really curious to see how this kind of moves forward for both of these teams and kind of what that means. But interesting to have this game played in week 0 with title game implications potentially. I know it's early, but I think when you have two teams that are expected to be in that race, this could be a game that you look back on and say, if not for this, this team would have been in there. So interesting there. And then, Kansas and Fresno State. Kansas is one of those teams that I think everybody's been really waiting for Jalen Daniels to have another breakout season. Obviously, he's had injuries over his career. He didn't practice much in spring because of recovering from injuries. And so it's just always been kind of a career that's been stuck with injuries. And last year, obviously, they came on strong at the end of the season. Not came on strong, but finished strong, I should say, and were able to do well. But, the beginning part of that season just didn't go well. And so I think there was still some hesitation with who this Kansas team can be. And I get it, right? I mean, until you can actually prove it on the field, it's tough to be able to understand what you have. But I think in this first game, and admittedly it's against Fresno State, and they're still kind of in their own kind of figuring out who they are. Usually Fresno State is a decent team to compete against. But this Kansas team absolutely did exactly what they needed to be competitive in this game and end up winning 31-7. It was clearly in Kansas's favor. There was not really any doubt that Fresno State would come away in this game. But Jalen Daniels, once again, his stat line isn't earth shattering. He threw for 176 yards and 3 touchdowns on 90% passing. But, that is, obviously the 90% passing, 3 touchdowns on so little production obviously is great. But I think, I felt much more confident watching him that he's maybe kind of the top of the Big 12 in terms of QB production. So we'll see, right? It's hard to know based on where these games are played and what's going on if that's the case. But I really loved what I saw out of Jalen Daniels and kind of what he can be for Kansas. So, this is a game that Utah has penciled in as the very last game of the season. They have to travel to Lawrence, Kansas on Black Friday. So they're essentially traveling on Thanksgiving. Depending on how the season goes for Utah, I'm really fascinated to see what this game could mean. Could it mean anything if there's something on the line? This is a Kansas team that's going to be tough. Assuming that both of these teams are still kind of where we think both of them are going to be, what does that mean? So really fascinated with that game. And then just a couple others. Hawaii beat Stanford 23-20. Just a crazy situation. Stanford obviously loses their head coach before the season starts. Not really in a good position. Have a lot of players transfer out. Just really tough situation, and it ends up coming down to Hawaii winning. And then the fun game that I loved to watch for some reason was UNLV beat Idaho State 38-31. Idaho State, this was a team that I thought, had this in the bag in some respects based on how they were taking it to UNLV. But the Rebels come back and find a way to get it done. You saw some former Utah players there. Not a ton of production, but some former Utah players in there. So with that said, let's jump into the week one look. Kyle Whittingham had his press conference this week today. And as was expected, no depth chart was released. Kyle, as you may remember, decided that he didn't want to put a depth chart out. And I don't know if this is gamesmanship just for the UCLA game, and we'll get one later on in the season. But this is just kind of where we're at now with this program. The program has limited a lot of the access that we get as media, and by default gives you less access as a fan because we can't tell these stories. And so it's been a struggle. Not as bad as UCLA is going through it this week or this last few weeks, but every program's evolving and kind of trying to figure out their things. So I'm curious to see how this moves forward. Today's press conference was honestly one of the shortest I've ever been to. It was 10 minutes. They cut us off pretty quick. So I'm hoping that that's not indicative of kind of how the rest of the season goes, because we're already not getting a ton of access, and it's been frustrating. So yeah, I don't know. That's kind of where I'm at right now. It's a little frustrating to kind of have this and not be able to ask a lot of the questions that we need or be able to talk to some of the players that we need to, but this is the world that we live in now. And unfortunately, the university is more interested in its own department in trying to get information out there. So good information it is, but it's tough when we're not able to kind of showcase that. So with that, no depth chart. We've talked about this, not really crazy, but interesting nonetheless. So we'll see how it all shapes up specifically. As a reminder, this week there will not be an injury report because these are not conference opponents. The Big Ten and the Big 12 do have injury/availability reports mandated for their teams, but only in conference games. So you won't see either one of these programs putting this out there. This is two teams that are going to try to hold everything that they possibly can back to not give the other an advantage. And you get it, right? Like neither one of these teams really fully understand what they have on the field, but at the same time, they know more than what they're able to show. And so I think you're going to get as much cloak and dagger type situation as possible this week as these two teams try to hold back as much as they can. And then I'm curious to see kind of how things move forward in the coming weeks. So one of the biggest questions that I have, though, is kind of looking at the offensive identity. And with the offensive identity is more kind of how they're going to establish. We've heard Jason Beck talk about how, the identity can evolve over the season simply because you may go into it having a plan and it doesn't go to plan. And so you have to kind of shift and move and alter it to make sure that you can get to what works. And so Kyle Whittingham talked about it in the sense that, they obviously want to be able to hit in week one in terms of what they feel like is an offensive identity. Obviously, they need to be much better than what they were last year. And assuming Devin Dampier stays healthy, I believe they believe that they have what it takes to be able to do it. But none of that will be known. The reality is here, they're trying to establish the run, right? Like that's what they're going to try to do. This is no secret. They've talked about this. This has been a good way of moving forward in the sense that that's kind of what they've wanted to do. But with that, you've got to be able to have, balance. And so, Kyle had talked about how they feel really good about their offense. They believe that, they have a good game plan going into this to be able to showcase what their identity can be. But at the end of the day, it's going to evolve, right? You won't know until what you have at game day. Utah has a ton of transfer players coming into this program. There's not a lot of holdover or consistency from the year before. Not that there was consistency last year, so not a big loss. But I think they're really focused on kind of trying to hit what they have and believing in what they have. But as he mentioned, there's going to be times where you think that a player is going to be a standout player, and then they just kind of fade to the background when the lights come on. So, are these players that we've talked about or heard about going to be those same guys? Or is it going to be one of those things where, somebody kind of falls back and somebody from the reserves kind of takes a spot? I think there's less of that, but there's still situations there. So curious to see what happens there. But, with this, as Utah tries to establish the run, they need to get wide receiver production. And I've said, a bunch this year that it's not like Utah needs to be lights out in the receiving game, right? It's one of those that they need to be effective, though, or else Utah's in a world of hurt. And Kyle kind of pointed to that a lot today in terms of saying that he believes that teams are going to stack the box because of Devin Dampier's ability. They're going to try to find ways to either keep him in the box and create havoc plays and bring pressures and whatever they can to kind of limit him that way. But they also have to respect that he can run, and so they're trying to figure out ways to be able to limit him that way. And so this is where Utah really needs that passing game to be able to work. They've got to be able to have something that will open that up so you respect it. And so, Kyle talked about Devin being really kind of the impetus in how this team is going to go. If opposing defenses are going to stack the box, which they should, you're going to get a spy on the QB or you're going to get different looks to be able to try to frustrate Devin Dampier. You've got to be able to find ways to be able to not just be one-dimensional, right? Like not just be a full run game. You've got to be able to have something that spreads the ball around. I do think with what Utah is going to do this year, whether that be in the screen game or whether that be, in shorter passes that allows Devin to kind of get the ball out quicker, I think Utah is going to be in a spot where they've kind of manufactured some easier stuff there to kind of relax him, right? You're not going to fully see him going right straight to a designed run immediately. And maybe they do to kind of keep guys on their toes, but I think you're going to see a little bit more of trying to set him up with easier passes to make sure that they can set it up for future. As they continue to develop that, maybe the defense sucks in a little bit and tries to expect the run, and then he beats him over the top with a deep bomb. It's really that cat and mouse game of trying to figure out how Utah can be balanced. Part of that balance is honestly just going to be the wide receiver stepping up. All right. Like we don't know a ton about this unit. We've obviously heard a lot about who they could be on paper, but until they step up, we still don't know if this is a team that can be balanced. And if they're not balanced, if the wide receivers can't be an impact on the game, where does Utah go? Do they go full triple option? Do they go like how are you manufacturing that? So that's really the question that I have. I'm curious to see how that goes. Kyle was asked a question about Tobias Merriweather, who I think many assume is going to be wide receiver one. I think he's got the body type, the physicality, the intangibles, so to speak, to be able to be that guy. But we'll see. He hasn't fully lived up to that potential from his time at Notre Dame or California yet, but we'll see what he can be But Kyle talked about him. He said, quote, "What we've seen in practice gives us confidence. What we've seen in practice has been very encouraging. But again, you've got to do it on game day." And, no real surprise there. This is a situation where, Tobias has done really well in what he's done in practice, but you've got to be able to produce in the game. And there's seemingly a chemistry with him and Devin Dampier, as well as, some of the other top receivers. But if it doesn't go well, what does that put Utah? If you don't have Tobias as your wide receiver one, is it Larry Simmons? Do you emphasize more Creed Whitmore or Ryan Davis and maybe your slot game? Do you utilize more of the tight ends in J.J. Buchanan, Dallin Bentley, Otto Tia? Like, where is this going to be? And so that, to me, is the fascination of kind of how this team is going to be balanced. Is it going to be the wide receivers, or is it the tight ends? Is it going to be different looks to be able to make sure that this team can do what they need to? To me, that's kind of the fascination there. So I'm really curious what happens there. Looking at the defensive side, Kyle said that they look, quote, very solid during fall camp. But then he added the caveat that they've struggled against the first team offense at times. He doesn't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing to some extent. We'll see what that means. I have heard that this offense, the first team offense, has been really stacked and solid, and they've been able to do really well at moving the ball. But is that an indication that Utah is really good on the offensive side of the ball and Devin Dampier is great? Or is that one of the things where you've got a defense that's just not really up to snuff and not able to do what they need to? So really curious there. Look, I mean, everybody's fascinated to know what's going on. You need Devin Dampier to stay healthy. You need him to be able to be effective. You need that offense to gel and be able to click, because I think most people expect to be able to get a consistent level on the defensive side of the ball, but we'll see what happens. And then lastly, just them studying UCLA. They have a new offensive coordinator from Indiana, so they've been watching a lot of tape on them. This is a UCLA team that's going through a bunch of transition as well. They went 5-7 last year, and so there's going to be a lot of questions about this team as well. We'll do a deeper dive on this later in the week as I bring on a guest to be able to talk about it. But this is a UCLA team that has a lot to prove as well. Utah obviously has a lot to prove with their 5-7 season, but this is a team that really needs to take hold in the Big Ten. And as it stands, it just doesn't seem like they have enough pieces to be able to be there yet, right? And I'm not saying competing with Penn State, Oregon, Ohio State, Michigan type levels. I think it's just really taking it to that next level to be competitive in the Big Ten. They had some good games last year, but this is a team that's got a lot more questions about it than Utah. And so really curious to see how they manage this. Is the new offensive coordinator good? Is Nico Iamaleava going to be a good quarterback for UCLA? How does he gel not being with the team that long? It's going to be really interesting to see how that goes. So like I said, we're going to get a guest on later this week to be able to discuss this. I've got to run. We've got practice again to go to and talk to players. So, we're going to do a little bit more deeper dive, but this is the last week of not having games. So hopefully we'll be able to do a little bit more deeper dive on some of these things, trying to be able to understand what this Utah team is. Are they going to be good? Are they going to, beat their 5-7 expectations? Are they going to have a higher ceiling? What's it going to be? So with that, we're going to sign out today, and we'll catch you later this week as we preview UCLA. With that, adios.